Some evils don't announce themselves with thunder or fire. They carve their marks in silence, in shadows, in the hollow eyes of those who survive them. There are wounds that don't bleed, scars that never show, and horrors that strip a soul down to nothing but whispers and dust. In the autumn of 1881, in a forgotten canyon in the Arizona Territory, one such evil left its mark on a woman who had forgotten how to scream. The Arizona Territory in those days was a land caught between two worlds, the old ways of the Apache fading like smoke on the wind, and the new world of white settlers spreading like a plague across the mesas and valleys. Towns sprouted up in places that had no business holding life, saloons and trading posts built on sand and blood. The earth itself seemed tired, cracked and sun-baked, stretching endlessly beneath a sky so blue it hurt to look at. Dust devils spun across the flats like drunken ghosts. Buzzards circled high above the arroyos, patient and knowing. And in the spaces between towns, where the law didn't reach, and God seemed to look the other way, men did things they'd never confess, things that would haunt them if they had souls left to haunt. Nakoa Flint knew this land better than any map could show. Half Apache, half white, he belonged fully to neither world, but moved through both with the silent grace of a shadow. His mother had been Chiricahua, a woman with eyes like obsidian and a voice that could calm storms. His father had been a trapper, a wanderer with Irish blood and a weakness for whiskey, who died when Nakoa was still too young to remember his face. Raised among his mother's people until the soldiers came with their rifles and their promises, he'd learned to track before he could read, to listen before he could speak, to see the stories written in bent grass and disturbed stones. The Apache had taught him that the land speaks if you know how to hear it. And Nakoa had learned to listen better than most. Now at 32, he worked as a scout for the army, guiding patrols through hostile country, finding water where there shouldn't be any, reading trails that others walked right over without seeing. He didn't care much for the work, didn't care much for the soldiers with their stiff uniforms and stiff morals, but it kept him fed and kept him moving. And moving was all that mattered. Standing still meant thinking, and thinking meant remembering his mother's face the day the soldiers took her, meant remembering the smell of burning wickiups, meant remembering the silence that followed the screaming. So he kept moving. It was a Tuesday, late afternoon in October, when Nakoa rode out from Fort Huachuca with nothing but jerky, a canteen, and a worn Winchester rifle slung across his back. The air was cooling as the sun began its descent, casting long shadows across the desert floor. He wasn't on army business this time. He'd heard rumors in town the night before, whispers in the back of a cantina from a Mexican trader who'd seen things he shouldn't have. Stories about a group of men operating out near the Dragoon Mountains, men who traded in things darker than whiskey or stolen cattle, men who took women from the trail, from homesteads, from anywhere they could find them alone. The trader had spoken in hushed tones, crossing himself twice before finishing his drink and leaving without another word. Nakoa didn't know what he'd find, didn't even know if he'd find anything at all. But something in his gut, that old instinct his mother had taught him to trust, the same instinct that had kept him alive through ambushes and sandstorms and long nights in the desert, told him to ride north. So he did. The land rose and fell in waves of red rock and sparse vegetation. Saguaros stood like silent sentinels, their arms raised to a sky that offered no mercy. The sun was sinking low, painting the rocks in shades of amber and rust and deep crimson when he saw the canyon. It was narrow, shadowed, carved deep into the earth by water that hadn't flowed in decades. A dry creek bed wound through it, lined with cottonwoods that hadn't seen rain in months, their leaves brown and brittle, clinging to branches like the last gasps of hope. The air changed as he entered the canyon. It was cooler here, sheltered from the direct heat, but there was something else too. A smell, faint but unmistakable. Smoke, old and stale, sweat, blood, the smell of something wrong. Nakoa dismounted, leading his horse by the reins, boots crunching softly on the gravel. He moved quietly, instinctively, every sense alert. His eyes scanned the ridges above, watching for movement, for the glint of metal, for anything that didn't belong. His hand rested near the knife at his belt, not out of fear, but out of habit. Out here, you never knew what you'd find or what might be waiting in the shadows. Then he saw it. A shape slumped against a boulder near the base of the canyon wall, half hidden beneath a scraggly juniper tree that offered more shadow than shelter. At first, he thought it was a dead animal, maybe a deer that had wandered down looking for water and collapsed. Then he saw the curve of a shoulder, the pale flash of skin against the dark rock. He stopped. His breath caught for just a moment. His hand moved to the knife at his belt, not to draw it, but to feel its weight, to remind himself it was there. He approached slowly, carefully, each step deliberate, his eyes never leaving the shape. As he got closer, the details became clearer, sharper, more terrible. It was a woman. She was sitting with her back against the boulder, knees pulled up to her chest, arms wrapped around them, like she was trying to hold herself together. She was wrapped in a tattered blanket that might have once been grey, but was now stained brown with dirt and dried blood. Her feet were bare, cut and swollen, caked with dust and blood. Her dress, what was left of it, hung in shreds from her shoulders, exposing bruised skin and open wounds. Her hair hung in matted tangles over her face, stiff with dried sweat and blood. She didn't move when he stopped a few feet away, didn't look up, didn't flinch. It was like she wasn't even there, like her body had given up on being alive, even though her lungs still pulled in air, even though her heart still beat. Nakoa crouched down, keeping his distance, keeping his hands visible, keeping his voice low and steady. "You hurt?" No answer, not even a flicker of acknowledgement. He scanned her body without moving closer, reading the story written on her skin. Bruises, dark and ugly, mottled purple and yellow, ran up her arms and disappeared beneath the blanket. Her wrists were rubbed raw, ringed with deep red marks, like she'd been tied with rope, tied tight enough to cut into flesh. Her lip was split, crusted over with dried blood. There was a gash above her left eyebrow, still seeping. Her hands, small and delicate, were scraped and bloody, nails broken and torn, but it was her eyes, when she finally lifted her head, that stopped him cold. They were empty. Not sad, not scared, not angry, just empty, like someone had reached inside and scooped out everything that made her human, everything that made her her, and left behind nothing but a shell. She looked at him for a long moment, studying his face with the detached curiosity of someone observing a stranger from a great distance. Then she spoke, her voice so quiet it barely carried over the wind, rustling through the dead cottonwoods. "I ain't clean inside or out." The words hit him like a physical blow, not because of what they meant, though that was clear enough, but because of how she said them, flat, factual, resigned, like she was stating the color of the sky or the temperature of the air. Nakoa didn't ask what happened. He didn't need to. The bruises, the torn clothes, the rope burns, the way she sat there like a broken doll, discarded by a careless child, it all told the story. And it was a story he'd heard before, seen before, in the faces of women who'd crossed paths with the wrong kind of men. Men who took what they wanted and left nothing but ruin in their wake. He stood slowly, his joints protesting slightly, and pulled off his coat. It was worn leather, sun-faded to a dull brown, smelling faintly of smoke and horse and the open desert. But it was clean, or as clean as anything got out here, and it was whole. He held it out to her, arm extended, waiting. She didn't take it, just stared at it like she didn't understand what it was for. Like the concept of someone offering her something without expecting payment was so foreign, it didn't compute. He set it down beside her gently, carefully, then stepped back several paces, giving her space, giving her air. "I'm not going to hurt you," still no response. She just stared at the coat, then at him, then back at the coat. Nakoa turned and walked back to his horse, his boots scraping against the gravel, the sound echoing off the canyon walls. He pulled his canteen from the saddle, unstoppered it, and filled a dented tin cup with water. The water was warm, tasted faintly of metal, but it was clean. When he returned, she was still sitting there, but her fingers had closed around the edge of his coat. clutching it like a drowning person clutches driftwood. He set the cup down within her reach, close enough that she could get it, far enough that he wasn't crowding her. Drink. She looked at the water like it might be poison, like this was a trick, a test, a trap waiting to spring. Then slowly, painfully slowly, she reached for it. Her hands shook so badly she nearly spilled it, water sloshing over the rim and spattering on the ground. But she got it to her lips and drank in small, desperate sips, her throat working, her eyes closing briefly as the water touched her cracked lips. Nakoa didn't rush her, didn't ask questions, didn't try to fill the silence with empty words or false comfort. He just sat down a few yards away, back against a rock, rifle across his lap, and waited. The sun dipped lower, touching the horizon, bleeding orange and red across the sky. The shadows stretched longer, deeper, swallowing the canyon floor. And in the silence, he could hear her breathing, ragged and uneven, like someone who'd been running for days and had finally stopped. The temperature dropped as the sun disappeared. The desert, brutal in its heat during the day, became cold at night, cold enough to kill if you weren't prepared. Nakoa built a small fire, using dry brush and dead wood from the cottonwoods, coaxing it to life with practiced ease. The flames crackled and popped, casting dancing shadows on the canyon walls, pushing back the darkness just enough. After a while, after the stars had begun to appear overhead, bright and cold and infinite, she spoke again. Her voice was stronger this time, not by much, but enough to notice. "Why'd you stop?" He glanced over at her. The firelight played across her face, highlighting the bruises, the cuts, the exhaustion etched into every line. Would have been wrong not to. She let out a sound that might have been a laugh, but it came out bitter and broken, more like a cough. Most men don't care about wrong. He didn't argue. She was right. He'd seen enough of the world, seen enough of what men did when they thought no one was watching, to know she was absolutely right. She pulled the coat tighter around herself, burrowing into it despite the fact that it was too big, the sleeves hanging past her hands. And for the first time since he'd found her, something flickered in her eyes. Not hope, that was too much to ask. Not trust, that would take time. Just the faintest recognition that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't about to die alone in this canyon. Nakoa stood and walked back to his horse, moving slowly, deliberately, making sure she could see everything he was doing. He untied a bedroll from behind the saddle and brought it over, laying it on the ground near the fire, but not too close. Close enough for warmth, but far enough to be safe. "You need rest." She looked at the bedroll, then at him, suspicion and confusion warring on her face. "You ain't taking me nowhere." "Not unless you want to go." Her brow furrowed, her eyes narrowing slightly, like she didn't understand the concept of choice anymore, like that word had been beaten out of her vocabulary. He settled back against the rock, adjusting the rifle across his lap, his gaze fixed on the canyon mouth where the darkness pressed in like a living thing. "Get some sleep. I'll keep watch." For a long time she didn't move. Just sat there, staring at him like she was waiting for the mask to slip, for the monster to show itself, for the trap to spring. But eventually exhaustion won. Her body couldn't fight anymore. She lay down on the bedroll, curling into herself like a child, still clutching his coat like a lifeline, like the only real thing in a world that had become unreal. Nakoa stayed awake through the night. Not because he didn't trust her, she was no threat, but because he knew what kind of men left women like this. And he knew they didn't like leaving witnesses. He knew they'd come looking eventually. Men like that always did. The stars wheeled overhead in their ancient dance. Coyotes howled in the distance, their voices rising and falling like a chorus of ghosts. An owl called from somewhere in the rocks, low and mournful. And somewhere out there in the darkness beyond the firelight, the world kept turning, indifferent and cruel, beautiful and terrible all at once. By dawn she was still asleep, her breathing finally steady and deep, the kind of sleep that comes when the body has nothing left to give. Nakoa stood, his joints stiff from sitting all night, and stretched, feeling his spine pop. He walked to the edge of the canyon and looked out over the land. The sun was just beginning to rise, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, illuminating the desert in harsh, unforgiving light. The land stretched out before him, vast and empty, beautiful and merciless all at once, a place where you could disappear and never be found. He didn't know her name yet, didn't know where she came from or what she'd seen or who had done this to her. But he knew this much. She wasn't going back to wherever she'd been. Not alone. Not while he was still breathing. Not while there was still something in him that remembered what it meant to be human. When she finally woke, the sun was already climbing, harsh and bright, casting no mercy on the world below. She sat up slowly, wincing with every movement, and looked around like she'd forgotten where she was. Then her eyes found him, standing near the horse, checking the saddle, and she went still, her body tensing like a cornered animal. He walked over slowly, keeping his movements predictable, and handed her a piece of dried meat. "You need to eat." She took it, but didn't bite into it right away. Just held it in her hands, staring at it like it might vanish if she looked away, like maybe this was all a dream, and she'd wake up back in that place, that hell, wherever it had been. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice gentle, not pushing. She hesitated, her mouth opening and closing like she'd forgotten her own name, like it had been taken from her along with everything else. Then finally, in a whisper so quiet he almost didn't hear it, "Lavinia," he nodded once, committing it to memory. "Nakoa," she didn't repeat it. Just looked down at the meat in her hands, her fingers trembling slightly. "There a town you need to get to?" he asked carefully. "Someone I can take you to, family?" She shook her head slowly, definitively, her hair falling forward to hide her face. "Ain't nobody." He studied her for a moment, reading the truth in her posture, in the way she said it. She wasn't lying. There really was nobody, and that, more than anything else, told him exactly how alone she'd been. How alone she still was. "All right," he said simply. She looked up at him sharply, confusion creasing her brow, making the cut above her eyebrow pull slightly. "All right, what?" "All right, you'll come with me." Her mouth opened like she wanted to argue, like she wanted to tell him he was crazy, that this was a bad idea, that she was more trouble than she was worth. But no words came out. Instead, tears welled up in her eyes, the first real emotion he'd seen from her since he found her. The first crack in the wall she'd built around whatever was left of her heart. She wiped them away quickly, almost violently, angry at herself for showing weakness, for letting him see. "I can't pay you." "Didn't ask you to." She stared at him, searching his face for the lie, for the angle, for the catch, for the moment when he'd show his true colors and reveal what he really wanted. But all she saw was a man who looked tired, weathered by sun and wind and years, honest in a way that didn't need proving, steady in a way that didn't need explaining. Nakoa turned and started packing up his gear, rolling the bedroll, kicking dirt over the fire until only ash remained. "We'll head west. There's a place I know, quiet off the main trails. Old Prospector's cabin hasn't been used in years. You can rest there till you figure out what's next." Lavinia stood shakily, her legs barely supporting her weight, still wrapped in his coat that hung on her like a tent. "Why are you doing this?" He paused in his work, glanced back at her over his shoulder, and said simply, quietly, with a finality that left no room for doubt, "Because somebody should." And with that, he helped her onto his horse, his hands careful and respectful, never lingering, never taking liberties. He swung up behind her, settled into the saddle, and clicked his tongue. The horse moved forward, carrying them out of that canyon, leaving nothing behind but footprints in the dust and ghosts in the shadows. The ride west took them through country that seemed determined to break anything foolish enough to cross it. The terrain shifted from red rock canyons to flat stretches of scrubland, dotted with mesquite and prickly pear. Then back to rolling hills, covered in loose shale that clicked and scattered under the horse's hooves. The sun climbed higher, turning the air into something you had to chew before you could breathe it. Nakoa kept the pace steady, but not punishing. Conscious of the woman riding in front of him, conscious of how her body swayed with exhaustion, how she gripped the saddle horn like it was the only thing keeping her tethered to the world. They didn't speak. There was nothing to say yet, nothing that wouldn't sound hollow or false. Words were cheap out here, cheaper than water, and Nakoa had learned long ago that silence often said more than 1,000 empty promises. So they rode in quiet, the only sounds the rhythmic clip of hooves on stone, the creak of leather, the occasional cry of a hawk circling overhead, around midday, when the heat was at its worst and the horizon shimmered with mirages that looked like lakes but were only lies. Nakoa guided them into the shade of an overhang. The rock face jutted out just enough to provide relief from the sun, and beneath it, a flat space where they could rest. He dismounted first, then helped Lavinia down, his hands supporting her weight as her legs nearly buckled. She caught herself against the horse, breathing hard, and he pretended not to notice. He unslung his canteen and handed it to her. She drank carefully this time, measured sips, like she was rationing something precious. When she handed it back, her eyes met his for just a moment before darting away. There was something in that glance, not quite gratitude, not quite trust, but maybe the beginning of something that could turn into either. Nakoa pulled out the jerky and offered her a piece. She took it and chewed slowly, mechanically, like eating was a task she'd forgotten how to enjoy. He ate his own share in silence, watching the land, always watching. His eyes scanned the ridges, the distant mesas, the open spaces where danger could appear without warning. Old habits, Apache habits, the kind that kept you alive when everyone around you was dying. After a while, Lavinia spoke, her voice still rough but stronger than before. "How far is this place?" "Another day's ride, maybe less if we push," he said, not looking at her, giving her the privacy of not being watched while she spoke. "It's tucked up in the foothills, hidden enough that most folks don't know it's there." "You live there?" "No, I move around. But I've used it before when I needed to disappear for a while." She absorbed that, nodding slowly. "You in trouble with the law?" "Not the law," he said, and left it at that. She didn't push. Maybe she understood that out here, everyone had reasons for the things they did, and most of those reasons were better left unspoken. Instead, she asked something else, something that had clearly been gnawing at her. "What if they come looking for me?" Nakoa finally looked at her then, really looked at her, and saw the fear beneath the exhaustion, the dread that had been building since she woke up. "They won't find you where we're going. You don't know that." "No," he admitted. "But I know how to cover a trail better than most men know how to follow one. And I know that if they do find you, they'll have to go through me first." The certainty in his voice, the quiet promise of violence if necessary, seemed to settle something in her. She nodded once and turned her gaze back to the shimmering heat beyond the overhang. They sat in silence for another hour, letting the worst of the midday sun pass, letting the horse rest, letting themselves breathe. When they resumed riding, the landscape began to change. The flat scrubland gave way to gentle rises, then steeper hills, then the beginnings of real elevation. Pine trees appeared, sparse at first, then more frequent, their scent cutting through the dust and heat. The air cooled incrementally, not enough to be comfortable, but enough to be noticeable. Water became more likely up here, hidden in springs and seasonal creeks that survived the summer by sheer stubbornness. As evening approached and the light turned golden, Nakoa spotted what he'd been looking for, a deer trail that branched off the main path, barely visible unless you knew what to look for. He guided the horse onto it, following the narrow track as it wound upward through the pines. The ground was softer here, covered in fallen needles that muffled their passage. It felt safer somehow, more enclosed, like the trees themselves were standing guard. They climbed for another hour, the trail switchbacking up the hillside, until finally it leveled out onto a small plateau ringed by pines and aspens. And there, nestled against the base of a rocky outcrop, was the cabin. It was small, barely more than one room, built from rough-hewn logs that had weathered to a silvery grey. The roof was intact, surprisingly, still covered with the wooden shingles some long-dead prospector had split by hand. The door hung slightly crooked on leather hinges, and the single window was covered with an old blanket that had faded to the colour of dust. Nakoa dismounted and helped Lavinia down again. She stood for a moment, swaying slightly, looking at the cabin like she couldn't quite believe it was real. He walked to the door, pushed it open with a creak that spoke of years without use, and stepped inside. The interior was dim, lit only by the fading daylight coming through the doorway. There was a stone fireplace against one wall, a rough table with 2 chairs, a wooden bunk built into the corner, and not much else. But it was dry, it was shelter, and it was far from anywhere that mattered. He stepped back outside and found Lavinia still standing where he'd left her, staring at the cabin with an expression he couldn't quite read. "It's not much," he said, "but it's safe." "It's more than I had yesterday," she replied quietly. Together, they unloaded the horse. Nakoa carried in his bedroll, a saddlebag with supplies, and his rifle. He started a fire in the fireplace, using kindling from a stack of dry wood someone had left behind years ago, probably him on his last visit. The flames caught quickly, spreading warmth and light through the small space. Lavinia stood near the door, watching him work, still wrapped in his coat despite the growing warmth from the fire. When the fire was burning steady, Nakoa stood and gestured to the bunk. "You take the bed. I'll sleep by the fire." She looked at the bunk, then at him, suspicion flickering across her face again. "Why?" "Because you need it more than I do." "That's not what I meant." Her voice had an edge now, a sharpness that hadn't been there before. "Why are you doing any of this? What do you want from me?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with the weight of everything she'd been through, every lie she'd been told, every promise that had turned into a trap. Nakoa met her gaze steadily, not backing down, but not challenging either. "I don't want anything from you, Lavinia. You needed help, I gave it. That's all. Nobody helps for nothing. Some people do," he said simply. "Not many, maybe, but some—" She stared at him for a long moment, searching his face for the crack in the facade, for the moment when the mask would slip. But his expression didn't change, didn't waver. Finally, exhaustion won out over suspicion. She nodded slowly and moved to the bunk, sitting down on the edge of it like she was testing whether it would hold. When it did, she lay back carefully, her body finally allowing itself to relax, just a fraction. Nakoa moved to the fireplace and started preparing a simple meal. Beans and salt pork from his supplies, cooked in a dented pot he found hanging on a nail. The smell filled the cabin, mixing with the scent of pine smoke and old wood. When it was ready, he filled 2 tin plates and brought one to Lavinia. She took it without a word and ate slowly, methodically, not looking at him. He sat at the table and ate his own meal, giving her space, giving her silence. Outside, night had fallen completely, and through the open door he could see stars beginning to appear, bright and sharp in the clear mountain air. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called and another answered. The night sounds of the forest, familiar and reassuring. When Lavinia finished eating, she set the plate aside and lay back down, pulling a moth-eaten blanket over herself. Within minutes, her breathing had deepened, slowed, fallen into the rhythm of sleep. Nakoa watched her for a moment, noting how even in sleep her body remained tense, coiled, ready to flee or fight. It would take time for that to change, if it ever did. He finished his own meal, cleaned the pot and plates with sand and water from his canteen, and settled by the fire with his rifle across his lap. The flames crackled and popped, casting dancing shadows on the walls. He should have been tired, should have been ready to sleep after a long day of riding, but his mind wouldn't quiet. He kept thinking about the men who had done this to her, wondering who they were, where they were, whether they were already looking. Men like that didn't just let things go. They had pride, twisted and ugly pride, and they didn't like being defied. Hours passed. The fire burned down to coals. Nakoa added another log, watching the flames lick up around it, catching on the dry bark. He thought about his mother, about the stories she used to tell him when he was young, stories about the old ways, about honor and responsibility, about what it meant to be a man worth the name. She would have approved of what he was doing, he thought. She would have said it was the only thing to do. Around midnight, Lavinia woke with a gasp, sitting bolt upright. her eyes wild and unfocused. Nakoa didn't move, didn't rush to her, just spoke quietly from his place by the fire. "You're safe. You're in the cabin. Nobody's here but me." She looked around frantically, her breathing ragged, trying to orient herself. Slowly, recognition returned. Her breathing slowed. She put a hand to her chest, feeling her heart hammer beneath her ribs. "I thought I was back there," she whispered. "You're not." She nodded, swallowed hard, and lay back down. But sleep didn't come as easily this time. She stared at the ceiling, at the rough beams barely visible in the firelight, and after a long silence, she spoke again. "They kept me in a cellar, underground, no windows, just darkness and dirt and the sound of their boots on the floor above me." Nakoa didn't respond, didn't interrupt. He just listened. "There were 4 of them," she continued, her voice flat, detached, like she was talking about something that had happened to someone else. "Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you." "They took me from a wagon train 3 weeks ago, killed the others, brought me to this house in the middle of nowhere. They said I was lucky, that I was pretty enough to keep." The word hung in the air, vile and heavy. "They took turns," she said. "At first I fought. I screamed and scratched and bit, but that just made them laugh, made them meaner. So I stopped. I went somewhere else in my head. I let them do what they wanted to the body, but I took my mind away, hid it somewhere they couldn't reach." Nakoa's jaw tightened, but he said nothing, just kept listening. "One night the youngest one got drunk, real drunk, left the door unlocked when he came down. I waited till he passed out, then I ran. Didn't take anything, didn't have shoes, didn't have a plan. Just ran. They came after me. I heard them shouting, heard the dogs. I don't know how long I ran. Days, maybe. I lost track. I thought they'd find me, thought I'd die out there, and part of me wanted to—" She stopped, her voice breaking for the first time. She took a shaky breath and continued. "Then you found me, and I didn't know if you were worse or better, didn't know if I'd just traded one hell for another." "You didn't," Nakoa said quietly. "I know that now," she replied. "Or I'm starting to. But it's hard to believe in anything." "Good after you've seen that much bad." He understood that. He'd seen his share of bad too, enough to make a man question whether there was any good left in the world at all. But he'd also seen moments of grace, small and fleeting, that reminded him why it mattered to keep trying. This was one of those moments, maybe. A chance to be something other than what the world expected. "Get some rest," he said gently. "Tomorrow we'll figure out what comes next." She nodded and closed her eyes. And this time, sleep came a little easier. Nakoa stayed awake through the rest of the night, keeping watch, keeping the fire burning, keeping the darkness at bay. Because that's what you did when someone needed protecting. You stood between them and the world, and you didn't flinch, didn't falter, didn't ask for anything in return. When dawn finally came, pale light filtering through the trees and painting, the world in shades of grey and gold, Lavinia woke to find Nakoa still sitting by the fire, still watching, still there. She sat up slowly and looked at him, really looked at him, seeing him clearly for the first time since he'd found her in that canyon. "You didn't sleep at all," she said. "I've gone longer," he replied, standing and stretching, his joints popping. "I'll rest later. Right now I need to see to the horse and check the area. You should eat something." He left the cabin, leaving her alone with the fire and the silence and the strange, unfamiliar feeling of being somewhere that didn't hurt. She stood on shaky legs and walked to the door, looking out at the morning. The forest was beautiful in a way she'd forgotten the world could be, green and alive and untouched by the ugliness of men. Birds sang in the trees. A breeze moved through, the pines carrying the scent of earth and growing things. For the first time in weeks, Lavinia Pierce allowed herself to think that maybe, just maybe, she might survive this. Not unchanged, that was impossible, but alive, breathing, still here. And maybe with time and distance and the help of a man who asked for nothing, she might even find a way to be whole again. She didn't know what came next, didn't know how long she could stay here, or what she'd do when she had to leave. But for now, for this morning, standing in the doorway of a forgotten cabin in the middle of nowhere, with the sun rising and the world waking up around her, it was enough. 3 days passed in the cabin, 3 days that felt suspended outside of time, like they existed in a pocket of the world where the rules were different and the past couldn't quite reach. Nakoa fell into a rhythm that felt natural despite its newness, waking before dawn to check the perimeter, gathering wood, hunting for game in the surrounding forest. He brought back rabbits and quail, cleaned them outside so Lavinia wouldn't have to see the blood, cooked them over the fire with wild onions he found growing near a spring. She ate more each day, her body slowly remembering what it meant to be nourished rather than simply surviving. Lavinia spent most of those first days inside, rarely venturing beyond the cabin door. She slept long hours, the kind of deep, death-like sleep that comes when the body finally believes it's safe enough to let go. When she was awake, she moved quietly through the small space, sometimes sitting by the fire, sometimes standing at the window watching the trees sway in the wind. She didn't talk much, and Nakoa didn't press her. Words would come when they were ready or they wouldn't, and either way was fine. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, Nakoa was outside splitting wood when he heard the cabin door creak open. He looked up to see Lavinia standing in the doorway, wearing a shirt and pants he'd found in an old trunk inside, clothes that had belonged to the prospector, or maybe some other wanderer who'd used this place before. They were too big on her, but they were clean and whole, and she'd tied the pants at the waist with a length of rope. Her hair was still tangled, but she'd worked some of the worst knots out, and her face, though still bruised and healing, had lost some of that hollow, haunted look. She stepped outside slowly, tentatively, like she was testing whether the world beyond the door would hurt her. When nothing bad happened, she took another step, then another, until she was standing in the small clearing in front of the cabin. She tilted her face up toward the sun, closing her eyes, and for a long moment she just stood there, breathing. Nakoa went back to splitting wood, giving her space to explore on her own terms. He heard her footsteps moving around the clearing, heard the rustle of pine needles under her feet. After a while, she appeared at his side, watching him work. He brought the axe down, splitting a log cleanly in two, then set up another piece. "Can I help?" she asked. He paused, considering. "You strong enough for that?" "Don't know," she admitted, "but I'd like to try. I'm tired of being useless." He handed her the axe, showing her how to grip it, how to let the weight do the work rather than forcing it. She took it awkwardly at first, nearly dropping it, but then adjusted her grip and raised it above her head. The first swing missed the log entirely, burying the blade in the dirt. The second caught the edge, but didn't split it. The third landed true, and the log cracked open with a satisfying thunk. A smile flickered across her face, brief and surprised, like she'd forgotten what accomplishment felt like. She set up another log and swung again. This time it split on the first try. They worked together for the next hour, Nakoa splitting the larger pieces while Lavinia handled the smaller ones. It wasn't efficient, and she had to stop often to catch her breath. But it was something, a purpose, an action that had nothing to do with survival and everything to do with living. When they finished, a respectable pile of split wood sat stacked against the cabin wall, enough to keep the fire going for weeks. That night, after they'd eaten and the fire had burned down to a comfortable glow, Lavinia spoke more than she had since telling her story that first night. She talked about small things, inconsequential things, like they were testing whether conversation could be normal again. She mentioned that she'd grown up in Missouri, that her father had been a schoolteacher before he died of fever, that her mother had remarried a man who drank and hit and made life unbearable. She'd left home at 16, worked as a seamstress in St. Louis for a few years, then decided to head west when she heard about opportunities in California. The wagon train was supposed to get her there. "Guess I should have stayed in St. Louis," she said with a bitter laugh. "Guess those men should have been something other than animals," Nakoa replied. "What happened to you isn't your fault. Don't carry their sin on your back." She looked at him across the fire, her eyes reflecting the flames. "You really believe that?" "I do." She was quiet for a moment, then nodded slowly, like she was trying to convince herself to believe it too. "What about you? You never talk about yourself. You got family?" "Had," he said. "Mother died when I was 12. Soldiers took her and the rest of our band to a reservation in New Mexico. She got sick on the way, fever like your father. Never. Made it there. I'm sorry." He shrugged, a gesture that tried to dismiss the weight but didn't quite succeed. "Long time ago, different life. You got anyone now? Wife? Children?" "No," he said simply. "Never stayed anywhere long enough for that. Wouldn't be fair to them anyway, the way I live." "The way you live," she repeated. "Always moving, always alone." "Sounds lonely." "Sometimes," he admitted, "but it's safer, for everyone." She seemed to understand what he meant, the implication that caring about people made them targets, made them vulnerable. Out here, in this world, attachment was a liability. But even as she understood it, she also recognized the tragedy of it, the slow erosion of humanity that came from cutting yourself off from connection. The conversation drifted after that, moving to easier topics, observations about the weather, speculation about whether the spring up the hill would last through winter, nothing deep or painful. When Lavinia finally went to bed, she said goodnight for the first time, a simple word that nevertheless felt significant, like they were establishing rituals, building something that resembled normalcy. Nakoa stayed by the fire as always, but that night his mind wandered to dangerous places. He found himself thinking about what it would be like to stay here, to stop moving, to build something permanent. The thought was seductive and terrifying in equal measure. He'd spent so long running from his past, from the ghosts of his people, and the guilt of surviving when so many hadn't, that the idea of standing still felt like surrender. But there was something about Lavinia that made him reconsider. Not romance, it wasn't that, at least not yet. It was something simpler and more profound, the recognition of shared damage, of two people who'd been broken by the world and were trying to figure out how to exist in the aftermath. Maybe that was enough. Maybe that was everything. The fourth day brought change in the form of clouds rolling in from the west, heavy and dark, pregnant with rain. Nakoa watched them gather through the morning, reading the sky the way his mother had taught him, seeing the signs that said this wasn't just a passing shower, but a real storm, the kind that could last for days. He spent the afternoon securing everything, making sure the roof was sound, that the woodpile was covered, that the horse was sheltered in the lean-to he'd built on the far side of the cabin. Lavinia helped, without being asked, following his lead, learning by watching. She was stronger now, he noticed, moving with more confidence, less hesitation. The fear was still there. He could see it in the way she startled at unexpected sounds, in the way she always positioned herself so she could see the door. But it no longer paralyzed her. The rain started just before dusk, big fat drops that splattered on the pine needles and turned the dirt to mud within minutes. Soon it was coming down in sheets, hammering on the roof, turning the world outside into a grey blur. They retreated inside, and Nakoa built up the fire to combat the sudden chill that came with the rain. The cabin felt smaller somehow, with the storm raging outside, more intimate, and for the first time since they'd arrived, there was an awkwardness between them, a heightened awareness of proximity. They ate dinner in relative silence, the sound of rain filling the spaces where conversation might have been. After they finished, Lavinia cleared the plates and set them aside. then surprised Nakoa by sitting down at the table across from him instead of retreating to the bunk as she usually did. "I want to ask you something," she said, her voice serious. "All right. When you found me, you could have just kept riding. Hell, most men would have. Some would have done worse than the ones who had me. But you stopped, you helped, you brought me here. You've asked for nothing in return." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "I need to know why. Not the easy answer, not because it was right. I need to know what's really driving this, because I can't figure out your angle and it's making me crazy." Nakoa leaned back in his chair, studying her face in the firelight. She deserved honesty, he realized. She'd been lied to enough, manipulated enough. If nothing else, he could give her truth. "My mother," he began slowly, "was one of the strongest people I ever knew. When the soldiers came for us, she didn't fight. She knew those mountains better than any white man ever would, could have disappeared and taken me with her. But she went peacefully because she thought it would mean safety for the children, for the old ones. She believed in the promises they made." He stopped, his jaw tightening at the memory. "They put us in wagons, packed us in like animals. It was summer, brutally hot, and they barely gave us water. My mother got sick the second day. By the 5th day, she was burning with fever. I begged the soldiers to stop, to let her rest, to get her help. They laughed, called her a squaw, said she'd make it or she wouldn't. Either way didn't matter to them." Lavinia's hand moved across the table, stopping just short of touching his, a gesture of comfort that didn't quite make contact. "She died on the 7th day, he continued. "I was holding her hand when she went. She looked at me and said something in Apache, something I didn't understand at the time because I was too young, too scared. But later, when I was older, I remembered the words and asked an elder what they meant." He paused, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "She said, 'Don't let the world make you cruel.' That was the last thing she ever told me." The rain continued to pound on the roof, filling the silence that followed. Lavinia's eyes were wet, reflecting the firelight, and when she spoke, her voice was thick with emotion. "So you help people because of her, because of what she asked. I help people because if I don't, then everything that happened to her, to all of them, it wins. The cruelty wins. The men who laughed at a dying woman, they win. And I can't let that happen. I won't." He finally met her eyes. "When I saw you in that canyon, I saw my mother. I saw every person who ever needed help and didn't get it. And I couldn't. I physically could not leave you there. Does that make sense?" "Yes," she whispered. "It makes perfect sense." Something shifted between them in that moment. Some invisible barrier dissolved. They weren't just two damaged people sharing space anymore. They were something else, something harder to define but no less real. Survivors, maybe. Witnesses to each other's pain. Co-conspirators in the act of refusing to let the world's cruelty have the final word. The storm raged on through the night, and for the first time since they'd met, Nakoa allowed himself to sleep, really sleep, while Lavinia kept watch by the fire. It was a small thing, an exchange of trust, but it mattered more than either of them could have articulated. In the morning, when he woke to find her still sitting there, exhausted but alert, her eyes on the door, protecting him the way he'd protected her, something in his chest tightened. "You should have woken me," he said. "You needed rest," she replied simply. "Figured I owed you at least one night." They smiled at each other then, small and tentative, but genuine. And in that smile was the acknowledgement of something neither was quite ready to name, a bond forged not in romance or obligation, but in mutual recognition of shared humanity in a world that seemed designed to strip it away. The rain continued for 2 more days, trapping them inside, forcing conversation and companionship. They talked about everything and nothing, swapping stories about their pasts, their hopes, their fears. Lavinia described her dream of opening a dress shop someday, somewhere quiet, where she could create beautiful things and be left alone. Nakoa talked about his wish to see the ocean, to stand on a beach and watch the waves come in, endless and eternal. On the third day, the rain finally stopped, leaving the world washed clean and smelling of wet earth and pine. They emerged from the cabin like prisoners, released from cells, breathing deeply, stretching their limbs. The forest around them looked different somehow, more alive, and as they stood there in the clearing, letting the sun dry the dampness from their skin, Nakoa realized with a start that he was happy. It was a foreign feeling, one he hadn't experienced in so long he almost didn't recognize it. But there it was, warm and unfamiliar, settling in his chest like a bird coming home to roost. He glanced at Lavinia and saw her smiling, really smiling, her face turned up to the sun, and he knew she felt it too, this strange, unexpected moment of peace. But peace, as both of them had learned, was always temporary. And somewhere, not as far away as they hoped, the past was already catching up. The settlement of Copper Ridge sat in a valley 15 miles south of the cabin, a collection of crooked buildings and false promises that called itself a town, but was really just a way station for men running from something or toward something equally desperate. Nakoa had been there twice before, both times briefly, both times leaving with the distinct impression that nothing good ever came from staying too long. But they needed supplies, coffee, and flour and ammunition, things that couldn't be hunted or foraged, and Copper Ridge was the closest place to get them. He debated leaving Lavinia at the cabin, thought about it seriously for a full day before deciding against it. Not because he didn't trust her to be alone, she'd proven herself capable enough over the past week, but because something in his gut told him that separating was a mistake. The men who'd had her were still out there somewhere, and men like that had friends, had connections, had ways of spreading word and gathering information. If they were looking, and he had to assume they were, then leaving her isolated made her vulnerable in ways he wasn't willing to risk. So on a clear morning in late October, they rode down from the foothills together, Lavinia sitting behind, him on the horse, her arms wrapped loosely around his waist. She'd protested at first, said she didn't want to be a burden, didn't want to slow him down, but he'd cut through her objections with simple logic. Two sets of eyes were better than one, and if trouble found them, he wanted her where he could. Reach her. The ride took most of the morning, winding down through pine forests that gradually gave way to scrub oak and juniper, then finally to the open valley floor where Copper Ridge squatted like a scar on the landscape. As they approached, Nakoa felt Lavinia's grip tighten, felt the tension radiating through her body. He understood. Towns meant people, and people meant questions, judgment, danger wrapped in the guise of civilization. "Stay close to me," he said quietly as they entered the outskirts. "Don't talk to anyone unless you have to. We get what we need and leave." She nodded against his back, her face pressed between his shoulder blades. Copper Ridge looked exactly as Nakoa remembered it, which is to say it looked like it was dying slowly and nobody cared enough to notice. The main street was rutted dirt, lined with buildings that leaned at angles that defied basic carpentry. A saloon called the Broken Spoke occupied the corner, its doors propped open despite the morning chill, releasing the smell of stale beer and unwashed bodies. Across from it stood a general store with a faded sign that read Hutchins Mercantile, and next to that a blacksmith shop where a man with arms like tree trunks hammered at something that glowed orange in the forge. There were people on the street, not many, but enough to make Nakoa cautious. A woman in a faded calico dress swept the boardwalk in front of what might have been a boarding house. Two men stood outside the saloon, smoking hand-rolled cigarettes and watching everyone who passed with the calculating eyes of predators. A boy of maybe 10 ran past chasing a mangy dog, both of them kicking up dust. Nakoa guided the horse to the hitching post outside the mercantile and dismounted, then helped Lavinia down. She kept her eyes on the ground, her shoulders hunched, making herself small. He wanted to tell her to stand tall, that she had nothing to be ashamed of, but he understood the impulse to hide, to avoid being seen. Sometimes invisibility was the best defense. Inside, the mercantile was dim and cramped, shelves packed with goods in no particular order that Nakoa could discern. Sacks of flour sat next to coils of rope. Canned goods shared space with mining equipment, and in one corner a dusty display of ladies' hats gathered cobwebs like they'd been there since the place opened. Behind the counter stood a man, Nakoa. Recognized from his previous visits, Silas Hutchins, the owner, a reed-thin man with a face like a dried apple and eyes that missed nothing. "Help you?" Hutchins asked, his gaze flicking from Nakoa to Lavinia and back again. Assessment happening. Behind those sharp eyes. "Need supplies," Nakoa said, pulling a list from his pocket, one he'd written out the night before. "Flour, coffee, salt, sugar, ammunition for a Winchester, needle and thread if you have it." Hutchins took the list and studied it, his lips moving slightly as he read. "Winchester? What caliber?" "44-40. The merchant nodded and began pulling items from shelves, setting them on the counter with practiced efficiency. As he worked, his eyes kept drifting to Lavinia, who stood near the door, her arms wrapped around herself, staring at a display of fabric bolts like they were the most fascinating thing she'd ever seen. "She with you?" Hutchins asked, his tone carefully neutral. She got a voice. "She does. She's also got nothing to say to you." Nakoa's voice carried an edge that made Hutchins raise his hands in mock surrender. No offense meant, just making conversation. He went back to gathering supplies, but Nakoa could feel the curiosity radiating off him, the questions forming that would go unasked but not unthought. While Hutchins tallied the purchases, Nakoa wandered over to where Lavinia stood. She'd picked up a bolt of blue fabric, running her fingers over it absently, and there was something wistful in her expression that made his chest ache. "You want that?" he asked quietly. She startled, dropping the fabric like it had burned her. "No, I was just looking. If you want it, we can get it. I don't need it," she said firmly, but her eyes lingered on the fabric for a moment longer before she forced herself to look away. Nakoa picked up the bolt and carried it to the counter, adding it to the pile of supplies. Hutchins raised an eyebrow but said nothing, just added it to the total. When everything was tallied, Nakoa paid with coins from a worn leather pouch, counting them out carefully. Money was precious, earned through scouting work and odd jobs, and it went fast in places like this. They were loading the supplies into saddlebags when the door opened, and 3 men walked in, bringing with them the smell of whiskey and trouble. Nakoa didn't recognize them, but he recognized the type, rough men with hard eyes and harder hands, the kind who took what they wanted and made jokes about it after. They moved through the store with the swagger of men who believed the world, owed them something, knocking items off shelves without apology, laughing too loud at jokes that weren't funny. One of them, a tall man with a scar running from his eyebrow to his jaw, noticed Lavinia, and his attention locked on her like a dog spotting a rabbit. He elbowed his companion, a stocky man with a handlebar mustache, and jerked his chin in her direction. They started moving closer, casual but purposeful, and Nakoa felt every muscle in his body tense. "Well, now," the scarred man said, his voice oily and presumptuous. "Ain't you a pretty little thing? You new in town?" Lavinia didn't respond, didn't even look up, but Nakoa saw her hands trembling, saw the color drain from her face. He stepped between her and the men, his body language clear and unmistakable. "She's with me, and we're leaving." The scarred man's smile didn't waver, but his eyes went cold. "I wasn't talking to you, Chief. I was having a conversation with the lady." "Conversation's over," Nakoa said flatly. For a moment, the tension in the room pulled tight as a bowstring. The scarred man's hand drifted toward the gun on his hip, not drawing it but making the threat clear. His companions spread out slightly, flanking positions, and Nakoa calculated angles, distances, how fast he could draw his knife, whether he could get Lavinia behind him before things went bad. Then Hutchins spoke up from behind the counter, his voice sharp and annoyed. "Cade, take your business outside. I don't need my store shut up because you can't leave well enough alone." The scarred man, Cade apparently, held Nakoa's gaze for another long moment, then smiled again, all teeth and no warmth. "Sure thing, Silas. We were just leaving anyway." He tipped his hat in Lavinia's direction, a gesture that managed to be both courteous and threatening. "Ma'am, hope we see you again sometime." The three men filed out, their laughter echoing back through the open door. Nakoa didn't relax until they'd been gone for a full minute, and even then, he kept one hand near his knife. He turned to Lavinia and found her shaking, her breath coming in short gasps, her eyes wide and panicked. "Hey," he said softly, putting a hand on her shoulder. "They're gone. You're all right." "I know him," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "The one with the scar. He was there, at the house. He was one of them." Everything inside Nakoa went cold and sharp. "You're sure?" She nodded, her whole body trembling now. "I'm sure." His voice, I'd know it anywhere. He was the one who laughed the loudest. Nakoa's mind raced, calculating odds and options and consequences. If Cade had recognized her, and there was a good chance he had despite her changed appearance, then their location was compromised. Word would spread, others would come, and the fragile safety they'd built at the cabin would evaporate like morning dew. They needed to leave, needed to move fast. But first, he needed to know what they were dealing with. He turned to Hutchins, who was watching the exchange with poorly concealed interest. "Those men, they regulars here?" Hutchins hesitated, clearly debating how much to say, then shrugged. "Cade Garrett and his boys. They work for a man named Dalton Mercer, runs a spread about 20 miles south of here. They come through every few weeks, spend money, cause trouble, leave. I don't ask questions because I like my windows intact." "This Mercer, what kind of man is he?" Another hesitation, longer this time. "The kind you don't cross if you value breathing. Rich, connected, mean as a snake, and twice as quick. Word is he's got judges and lawmen in his pocket all the way to Santa Fe." Nakoa absorbed this information, adding it to what he already knew, building a picture he didn't like. "He deal in anything besides cattle?" Hutchins' eyes flicked to Lavinia, then back to Nakoa, and something like understanding passed across his face. "I've heard stories. Nothing I could prove. But yeah, I've heard stories." That was all Nakoa needed to hear. He gathered the last of the supplies, handed Hutchins an extra coin for his discretion, though he doubted it would buy much, and guided Lavinia toward the door. As they reached it, Hutchins called out, "Friend, if that girl's running from Mercer, you should know he doesn't let go of what he considers his. And he's got a long reach." "Thanks for the warning," Nakoa said, and meant it. Outside, the street seemed more crowded than before, or maybe Nakoa was just more aware of the eyes on them, the attention they were drawing. He helped Lavinia onto the horse, noting how she kept looking around frantically, searching for threats in every shadow. He mounted behind her and turned the horse north, back toward the hills, resisting the urge to kick it into a gallop that would only draw more attention. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story. They were at the edge of town when a voice called out behind them. "Hold up there!" Nakoa turned to see a man in a dusty suit and a tin star pinned to his vest. The town marshal, presumably, walking toward them with the unhurried confidence of someone who believed his authority meant something. He was middle-aged, soft around the middle, with a face that suggested he'd rather be drinking than working. "Need to ask you some questions." the marshal said, his hand resting on his gun belt in what he probably thought was an intimidating manner. We're just passing through, Nakoa replied evenly. Bought supplies, paid for them, now we're leaving. That may be, but I heard there was some trouble in the mercantile. Witnesses say you threatened Cade Garrett. Witnesses got it backwards. Garrett bothered the lady, I intervened. Now we're leaving. The marshal's eyes narrowed, and he looked past Nakoa to Lavinia. The lady have a name. Before Nakoa could answer, before he could deflect or redirect, Lavinia spoke up, her voice stronger than he'd heard it all day. My name is Lavinia Pierce. I'm traveling with this man of my own free will. We had no trouble with anyone except men who wouldn't take no for an answer. Now if you'll excuse us, Marshal, we have a long ride ahead. Something in her tone, the sheer force of will behind it, seemed to surprise the Marshal as much as it surprised Nakoa. The lawman stepped back slightly, reassessing, and in that moment of hesitation, Nakoa clicked his tongue and the horse moved forward. The Marshal let them go, though Nakoa could feel his eyes on their backs all the way out of town. They rode hard once they were clear of Copper Ridge, pushing the horse faster than was wise on rough terrain, putting distance between themselves and whatever was brewing behind them. Nakoa's mind was already working through contingencies, what they'd need to do if Mercer's men came looking, how defensible the cabin was, whether they should abandon it entirely and keep moving. The variables were endless, and none of the calculations came out in their favor. It was nearly dusk when they finally slowed, the horse lathered and breathing hard. They'd climbed back into the foothills, surrounded by pines that offered cover and concealment, and for the moment at least, they were alone. Nakoa dismounted and helped Lavinia down, and as soon as her feet hit the ground, she turned and vomited, her body purging the fear and adrenaline that had been building all day. He held her hair back, one hand on her shoulder, saying nothing because there was nothing to say. When she finished, she wiped her mouth with the back of her hand and straightened, her face pale but determined. I'm sorry, she said. For what? For putting you in danger. For making you a target. You should have left me in that canyon. Stop, he said firmly, turning her to face him. What happened in that town wasn't your fault. Those men, Mercer, all of it, that's on them, not you. And I didn't save you, just to abandon you the first time things got difficult. We're in this together now, understand? She searched his face, looking for the lie, for the moment when he'd revealed this was all conditional. But she didn't find it because it wasn't there. Finally, she nodded, and some of the tension left her shoulders. They made camp there in the trees, rather than pushing onto the cabin in the dark. Nakoa built a small fire, just enough for warmth, not enough to be seen from a distance, and they ate cold jerky and drank water from the canteen. Neither of them spoke much, both lost in their own thoughts, contemplating the crossroads they'd arrived at without meaning to. As the stars emerged and the temperature dropped, Lavinia finally broke the silence. What are we going to do? Nakoa poked at the fire with a stick, watching sparks spiral upward into the darkness. We have choices. We can run, keep moving, try to stay ahead of them. Or we can make a stand, prepare for them to come and be ready when they do. Or he paused, considering the third option, the one that felt most dangerous, but also most final. We can go after them first. Find Mercer, end this before it ends us. You'd do that? Risk your life to end mine? It's not just your fight anymore, he said simply. The moment Cade saw you, the moment he recognized you, it became my fight too. Besides, he added with a grim smile, I've been in worse situations. She laughed, a short, bitter sound that held no humor. Somehow I doubt that they sat in silence for a while longer, the weight of impending violence settling over them like a shroud. Tomorrow, they'd decide which path to take, which choice to make from a list where none of the options were good. But tonight, in this moment, they were still alive, still together, still fighting. And maybe, Nakoa thought, as he watched Lavinia stare into the flames, maybe that was enough. The decision came at dawn, unspoken but understood between them, as they broke camp and began the ride back to the cabin. They wouldn't run, wouldn't spend the rest of their lives looking over their shoulders, jumping at shadows and trusting no one. And they wouldn't wait like sheep in a pen for wolves to arrive. They'd go on the offensive, take the fight to Dalton Mercer before he could bring it to them. It was reckless, probably suicidal, but it was also the only choice that allowed them to keep their dignity intact. Back at the cabin, they spent the day preparing with the methodical focus of soldiers before battle. Nakoa cleaned and loaded every weapon they had. His Winchester rifle, a spare revolver he'd taken off a dead man years ago, and 3 knives of varying sizes. He checked the mechanisms, tested the triggers, counted ammunition twice to be certain. They had enough bullets for a sustained fight, but not a prolonged one, which meant they'd need to be smart, precise. No room for wasted shots or second chances. Lavinia worked on provisions, packing food that would keep, filling canteens, rolling blankets tight and securing them with leather straps. She moved with purpose now, the trembling fear from yesterday replaced by something harder, colder. Nakoa recognized it because he'd felt it himself many times, the moment when survival instinct transforms into something more aggressive, when the prey decides to become the predator. It was dangerous, that transformation, because it meant you'd crossed a line you could never uncross. But sometimes crossing that line was the only way to stay alive. As the sun climbed toward noon, Nakoa spread a rough map on the cabin table, one he'd drawn from memory based on years of scouting this territory. He marked Copper Ridge, then traced a line south to where Hutchins had said Mercer's ranch lay. 20 miles through mixed terrain, open valleys and rocky hills, places where an ambush could come from any direction. They'd need to approach carefully, scout the layout before making any moves, identify guards and weak points and escape routes. "Tell me about the house," he said to Lavinia, who'd come to stand beside him, studying the map with intense concentration. "Where they kept you. What you remember." She closed her eyes, and he watched her face tighten as she forced herself back into memories she'd been trying to forget. "It was big," she said slowly. 2 stories, adobe and wood, built around a courtyard. The cellar where they kept me was accessed from the kitchen, a trapdoor in the floor. There were at least 6 men living there, maybe more. Guards patrolled at night, usually 2 of them, changing shifts every few hours. Dogs. 3 mean ones. They kept them chained during the day, but let them loose after dark. Nakoa nodded, adding this information to his mental calculations. Dogs complicated things, made silent approaches nearly impossible. They'd need to account for that, maybe find a way to neutralize them before attempting entry. "How many women besides you?" Her jaw clenched. "When I left, there were 2 others, both younger than me. One was Mexican, couldn't have been more than 15. The other, I never learned her name. She didn't speak, just stared at the walls like she'd gone somewhere inside herself and couldn't find the way back. The rage that rose in Nakoa's chest was cold and focused. The kind of anger that didn't burn hot, but settled into your bones and stayed there, driving you forward. "We'll get them out," he said quietly. "All of them?" "That's not why we're going," Lavinia said, her voice hard. "We're going to kill Mercer. To end this, we can do both." She looked at him then, really looked at him, and something flickered in her eyes, surprise maybe, or gratitude, or the recognition that even in the pursuit of vengeance, he was still trying to be decent. "You're a strange man, Nakoa Flint. I've been called worse." They left the cabin at dusk, timing their departure so they'd arrive at Mercer's ranch in the deepest part of night when guards were tired and attention wandered. The ride south retraced their path from the day before, but this time they moved with deliberate stealth, avoiding open ground, staying to the tree lines and shadows. The moon was a thin crescent, offering just enough light to see by without exposing them completely. Hours passed in tense silence, the only sounds the horses' hooves on soft earth and the occasional call of a night bird. Nakoa's senses were heightened, every nerve alert, reading the land for signs of danger or pursuit. Twice they stopped completely, freezing in place while riders passed in the distance, too far away to be a threat, but close enough to remind them they were entering hostile territory. Around midnight, they reached a rise overlooking a valley, and there, spread out below them like a statement of wealth and power, was Mercer's ranch. Lavinia had been right about its size. The main house was massive, a sprawling structure that spoke of money made from sources legitimate and otherwise. Outbuildings dotted the property, a barn, a bunkhouse, what looked like a smokehouse, and a stable. Lights burned in several windows, and as Nakoa watched, he counted 4 guards making rounds, their patterns overlapping to cover all approaches. "That's it," Lavinia whispered, her voice tight with remembered trauma. "That's where they kept me." Nakoa studied the layout for a long time, memorizing details, looking for weaknesses. The courtyard Lavinia had mentioned was visible from this angle, enclosed on 3 sides by the house, with the 4th side open to the valley. That opening was both a vulnerability and a trap, easy to enter, but equally easy to defend. The cellar entrance through the kitchen meant they'd need to get inside the main house, past however many men were sleeping there. Past the guards outside, past the dogs. "This is insane," he muttered, more to himself than to her. "I know," she replied. "Are we doing it anyway?" He looked at her, saw the set of her jaw, the determination in her eyes, and knew there was no talking her out of this even if he wanted to. And the truth was he didn't want to. Some evils needed to be confronted directly, needed to be cut out at the root before they could spread further. Mercer was that kind of evil, and men like him only understood one language. "We're doing it," he confirmed. "But we're doing it smart. We wait here, watch the patterns, learn the timing. When we move fast, and we don't stop until it's done." They spent the next 2 hours observing, and patterns emerged. The guards changed shift at what Nakoa estimated was 2-hour intervals. A brief moment of confusion when the transition happened that left gaps in coverage. The dogs, as Lavinia had said, roamed free but stayed mostly near the bunkhouse, suggesting that's where they were fed. The main house had lights in the upper windows that suggested Mercer kept late hours, but the lower floor was dark except for one room, probably the kitchen where someone might be preparing for the morning. At what Nakoa judged to be roughly 3 in the morning, when exhaustion makes even the most vigilant guards sloppy, they made their move. They left the horse tied in a copse of trees with enough slack in the rope that it could break free if needed, then descended the slope on foot, moving low and slow. Using every bit of cover the terrain offered, the first obstacle was the dogs. As they approached the perimeter of the ranch, Nakoa pulled 3 strips of meat from his pack, jerky he'd soaked in a tincture made from herbs his mother had taught him about. Plants that induce sleep without killing. It was a gamble. He'd never tested this particular mixture on dogs, but it was better than the alternative of cutting their throats and alerting everyone with their death sounds. He tossed the meat to where the dogs were lounging near the bunkhouse, and 3 heads lifted immediately, noses twitching. After a moment's hesitation, they approached the unexpected food and consumed it quickly, fighting briefly over the last piece. Nakoa and Lavinia waited, crouched in shadow, barely breathing. 5 minutes passed, then 10, and gradually the dogs' movements slowed, became uncoordinated. They lay down one by one, heads on their paws, and within 15 minutes, all 3 were unconscious. "Move," Nakoa whispered, and they ran in a crouch toward the main house, covering the open ground as quickly as silence would allow. They reached the wall and pressed against it, hearts pounding, waiting for the shout that would mean they'd been spotted. But no alarm came. Nakoa edged along the wall toward what he hoped was the kitchen entrance, a door smaller and less formal than the main entry. It was locked, but locks were just puzzles, and he'd learned to solve this particular kind years ago. He pulled a thin piece of metal from his pocket, worked it into the mechanism, feeling for the catch, and after a moment that felt like an eternity, something clicked. The door swung open silently. Well-oiled hinges, betraying wealth and maintenance. They slipped inside, and Nakoa eased the door closed behind them. The kitchen was dark, smelling of old grease and wood smoke, with a large table dominating the center and pots hanging from hooks on the walls. And there, exactly where Lavinia had described it, was the trapdoor set into the floor. But before they could move toward it, a voice spoke from the darkness near the far wall. Wondered when you'd show up? Nakoa spun, knife in hand, placing himself between Lavinia and the voice. As his eyes adjusted, he made out a figure sitting in a chair, relaxed and waiting. A match flared, illuminating the face of Cade Garrett, the scarred man from Copper Ridge, and the flame touched the end of a cigarette. "Mercer figured you'd come," Cade said conversationally, as if they were discussing weather. "Told me to wait here, said you seem like the type who'd rather attack than hide." Guess he was right. Nakoa's mind raced, calculating distances and angles. Cade's hand wasn't on his gun, but it was close, and at this range, whoever drew first would win. "You going to try to stop us?" he asked. Cade took a drag of his cigarette, the ember glowing red in the darkness. "That depends. You here for revenge or rescue?" Both. Figured as much. Cade stood slowly and Nakoa tensed, but the man made no move toward his weapon. "I'm going to tell you something, and you're going to think I'm lying, but I'm not. I'm tired of this. Tired of Mercer, tired of what we do here, tired of pretending it doesn't make me sick every time I wake up. Then why do it?" Lavinia's voice, sharp and accusing, cut through the darkness. "Because men like me don't have many choices," Cade replied. "Because I've done things that mean I can't go back to being decent even if I wanted to. But maybe I can do one decent thing before I die. And tonight feels like the night for it." Nakoa didn't believe him, didn't trust him, but he also recognized the tone in Cade's voice. The exhaustion of a man who'd carried guilt for too long and was looking for a way to set it down. "What are you offering?" "Information and a head start," Cade said. "Mercer's upstairs, sleeping off a bottle of whiskey. There are 2 other men in the house, both drunk and useless. The girl's in the cellar. There are 3 now. Another one came in yesterday. The guards outside don't know you're here yet, but they will the second gunfire starts. So if you're going to do this, do it quiet and do it fast." "Why should we believe you?" Lavinia demanded. Cade looked at her, and even in the dim light, Nakoa could see something like regret cross his scarred face. "Because I remember you. Remember what we did. And I can't undo it, can't make it right. But maybe I can keep it from happening to someone else. That's all I got left." The moment stretched, fragile and dangerous, balanced on the edge of a knife. Then Nakoa made a decision, one he'd probably regret, but felt right in a way he couldn't explain. "The cellar. Open it." Cade moved to the trapdoor and pulled it open, revealing a wooden ladder descending into darkness. A smell wafted up unwashed bodies and fear and despair, and Nakoa's jaw clenched so hard his teeth ached. He looked at Lavinia and saw tears streaming down her face, silent and furious. "Go," he said to her. "Get them out. I'll handle Mercer. I want to be there when you kill him," she said. "I know, but those girls need you more than I do right now. Get them out, get them to the horse, and wait for me. If I'm not there by dawn, ride north and don't look back." She looked like she wanted to argue, but practicality won out. She nodded once, fierce and final, then descended into the cellar. Nakoa turned to Cade. "You coming or staying?" "I'll hold the guards if they come," Cade said. "But after tonight, I'm gone. Tell anyone who asks that Cade Garrett died here." Nakoa nodded, an acknowledgement between 2 men who understood that sometimes redemption required burning your old life to ash. Then he turned toward the stairs that led up to where Dalton Mercer slept, comfortable and secure in his power, unaware that judgment was climbing toward him through the darkness. The stairs creaked softly under Nakoa's weight, and he moved with the practiced stealth of a hunter approaching prey. At the top, a hallway stretched in both directions, doors closed on both sides. But one door stood slightly ajar, and from within came the sound of snoring, deep and rhythmic, the sound of a man who'd never had reason to fear the night. Nakoa pushed the door open slowly and stepped inside. The room smelled of expensive tobacco and cheap decisions. A masculine space, decorated with the trophies of a man who measured worth in domination. Mounted animal heads stared with glass eyes from the walls. A grizzly bear frozen mid-roar, an elk with antlers that spread like skeletal branches, and in the corner, incongruously, a mountain lion caught in perpetual snarl. The bed was massive, carved from dark wood that probably cost more than most men earned in a year. and in it, sprawled on his back, with one arm thrown over his face, lay Dalton Mercer. He was bigger than Nakoa expected. Not fat, but solid, the kind of size that came from good food and brutal enforcement of will. His hair was going grey at the temples, and his face, visible in the moonlight streaming through the window, had the kind of handsomeness that probably opened doors before his money and violence finished the job. He wore a silk nightshirt, another display of wealth, and even in sleep, his expression held a cruel satisfaction, like his dreams were as pleasant as his waking hours were terrible. Nakoa stood there for a long moment, knife in hand, watching the rise and fall of Mercer's chest, contemplating how easy it would be to end this right now. One quick motion, steel across throat, and the architect of so much suffering would bleed out without ever waking. Clean, efficient, the kind of death men like Mercer didn't deserve, but that would accomplish the goal. But something stopped him, not mercy. Mercer had forfeited any claim to that, but the recognition that some men needed to know why they were dying, needed to face their crimes in their final moments. So instead of cutting, Nakoa pressed the blade against Mercer's throat, just hard enough to break skin, and watched as the man's eyes snapped open. The transition from sleep to waking confusion to understanding happened in seconds. Mercer tried to move, but the knife pressed harder and he froze, intelligence overriding panic. His eyes found Nakoa's face, and even in the dimness, recognition sparked. "You're the scout," he said, his voice surprisingly calm for a man with a blade at his neck. "From Copper Ridge, the one with the girl. Her name is Lavinia Pierce," Nakoa said quietly. "And she's not your girl. Never was?" Mercer's lips curled into something that might have been a smile if it held any warmth. "So she sent you to kill me. Didn't have the courage to do it herself, I see. She's downstairs, freeing the women you keep in a cellar like animals," Nakoa replied. "And when I'm done here, we're burning this place to the ground." "Bold words from a dead man," Mercer said. "You think you can kill me in my own house and walk away? I have 20 men on this property. The second they hear gunfire, you're finished. Then I guess we'd better keep this quiet." Something shifted in Mercer's eyes then, a flicker of fear breaking through the arrogance. "You're making a mistake. I have powerful friends, judges, territorial officials, men who will hunt you to the ends of the earth if you do this. But if you walk away now, I'll let it go. Take the women, disappear, and we'll call it even." Nakoa almost laughed at the absurdity of the offer, at the sheer audacity of a man trying to negotiate from a position of having lost everything. "You think I believe that? You think I'm fool enough to trust a promise from a man who traffics in human misery? Then what do you want?" Mercer's composure was cracking now, desperation bleeding through. "Money? I have plenty. Land? I can deed you a section, prime grazing near water. Name your price." "There is no price," Nakoa said, and pressed the knife deeper, watching a thin line of blood trace down Mercer's neck. "Some things can't be bought or sold or negotiated. Some debts get paid in blood." Before he could finish the motion, before he could end it, a voice spoke from the doorway. "Wait." Nakoa's head snapped around to see Lavinia standing there, 3 women behind her, all of them thin and hollow-eyed, wrapped in blankets someone had given them. She stepped into the room, and in her hand was the revolver Nakoa had given her before they left the cabin, her finger resting along the trigger guard. Proper form that suggested someone had taught her to shoot. "Lavinia," Mercer breathed, and there was something in his voice now, not quite fear but close to it. "Sweet girl, tell your friend he's making a terrible mistake. Whatever I did, whatever you think happened, we can talk about it, work it out." "Don't call me that," she said, her voice like iron wrapped in ice. "Don't you dare call me sweet or girl or anything else. You lost the right to speak to me like I'm human the first time you locked me in that cellar. I gave you shelter, fed you, kept you safe from men who would have treated you far worse." The lie was so blatant, so grotesque, that Lavinia actually laughed, a sound devoid of humor that made the hair on Nakoa's neck stand up. "Safe? You call what you did keeping me safe?" She moved closer, the gun steady in her hand. "You and your men took turns with me like I was property. You beat me when I fought back and starved me when I wouldn't break fast enough. You stole my dignity, my humanity, everything that made me who I was, and you dare talk about safety. I could have killed you." Mercer shot back, dropping the pretense now, revealing the monster beneath. "Could have used you up and thrown you in a ditch like the others. But I didn't. I kept you alive. You kept me alive so you could hurt me longer," Lavinia said, and now the gun was pointed directly at his head. "You kept me alive because breaking me slowly gave you more pleasure than killing me quickly. Don't you dare act like that was mercy." The room fell silent, except for Mercer's breathing, which had become rapid and shallow. Nakoa remained where he was, knife still at the man's throat, but he understood now that this moment belonged to Lavinia, not him. This was her choice to make, her justice to claim or decline. "Please," Mercer whispered, and the words sounded strange coming from him, like a language he'd never learned to speak properly. "Please, I'll do anything. I'll leave the territory, go east. You'll never see me again. Just let me live." Lavinia stood there for a long moment, the gun unwavering, and Nakoa could see the war playing out behind her eyes. The desire for vengeance, battling against the cost of taking a life. The need for justice, weighing against the knowledge that killing changed you in ways you couldn't predict or undo. He knew that war intimately, had fought it himself many times, and he knew there was no right answer, only choices and consequences. "I want you to understand something," Lavinia said finally, her voice eerily calm. "I'm not going to kill you because you deserve to die, though you do. I'm not going to kill you because it would make me feel better, though it might. I'm going to kill you because as long as you're alive, you're a threat. To me, to those women downstairs, to every other girl you'd take if given the chance. You're a disease, Mr. Mercer, and the only cure for what you are is to cut you out completely. Wait. Please, God, wait." The gunshot was deafening in the enclosed space. A thunderclap that shattered the night and ended all negotiation. The bullet caught Mercer in the center of his forehead, snapping his head back and painting the expensive pillows with a spray of red and grey. His body spasmed once, twice, then went still. And the great Dalton Mercer, who'd thought himself untouchable, died the way all men die, suddenly and completely. With no chance for last words or grand exits, for a moment nobody moved. The three women in the doorway stood frozen, eyes wide, processing what they'd just witnessed. Nakoa slowly removed his knife from Mercer's throat, the gesture now unnecessary, and wiped the blade clean on the dead man's silk nightshirt. And Lavinia stood with the gun still extended, smoke curling from the barrel, staring at what she'd done. Then sound exploded from everywhere at once. Shouts from outside, boots pounding on floors below. The organized chaos of men responding to gunfire. The moment of decision had passed, replaced by the brutal necessity of survival. Nakoa grabbed Lavinia's arm, breaking her from her trance. "Move now!" They ran, all five of them, thundering down the stairs toward the kitchen. As they reached the bottom, they heard the front door burst open, heard men flooding into the house. But they also heard gunfire from a different direction, from outside and through the kitchen window. Nakoa saw Cade Garrett standing in the courtyard, firing at the guards who'd come running, buying them precious seconds. "The back way," one of the rescued women said. A Mexican girl who'd found her voice somewhere between the cellar and freedom. "There's a door through the pantry." They followed her lead, squeezing through a narrow storage room, lined with canned goods and sacks of flour, emerging into the night air on the far side of the house. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit grew louder, more organized. Men were mobilizing, grabbing weapons, and soon this entire valley would be swarming with armed riders looking for revenge. "Head for the trees," Nakoa commanded, pointing toward the slope they'd descended hours earlier. "Run and don't stop, I'll catch up." "I'm not leaving you," Lavinia said fiercely. "You have to. They need you more than I need you right now." He pressed a small leather pouch into her hand, the one with the remaining coins. "Get them somewhere safe. Find a town with a church, somewhere Mercer's influence doesn't reach. Get them help, Nakoa, go!" He roared, and the force of it sent her stumbling backward. The other women were already running, and after one last desperate look, Lavinia turned and ran after them, disappearing into the darkness. Nakoa turned back toward the house, toward the chaos and the violence, and felt a strange calm settle over him. He'd known it might end like this, had accepted that possibility when they'd decided to come here. Some battles you walked away from, and some you fought until there was nothing left to fight with. This was shaping up to be the latter. He made it 10 steps before the first bullet kicked up dirt near his feet. He dropped into a crouch and returned fire, his Winchester barking in the darkness, and somewhere in the confusion he heard someone scream. More shots came, a dozen guns firing in his general direction, and he scrambled behind a water trough, the thick wood offering temporary protection. This was it then. The last stand he'd always suspected was coming. He thought about his mother, wondered if she'd be proud of how he'd chosen to die, fighting against cruelty rather than accepting it. He thought about Lavinia and the 3 women running through the darkness, hoped they'd make it far enough fast enough that Mercer's men would give up the chase. He thought about all the things he'd never done and never would, never saw the ocean, never built anything permanent, never had children to carry his name forward. Then Cade Garrett appeared beside him, sliding down behind the trough, reloading his gun with practiced efficiency. "Thought you were gone," Nakoa said. "Changed my mind," Cade replied, snapping the cylinder closed. "Figured if I'm going to die, might as well die doing something worthwhile." "Redemption in the last act?" "Something like that," Cade grinned, a wild expression that suggested he'd made peace with whatever came next. "Besides, these odds are terrible. And I always did like a challenge." They fought together then. 2 men who'd been enemies hours before, united by the simple understanding that sometimes you stand with the person next to you, regardless of history. They fired and moved, using the chaos and darkness to their advantage, making every shot count because ammunition was finite and pursuers were not. The fight lasted perhaps 10 minutes, though it felt like hours. A blur of muzzle flashes and shouted orders, and the wet sound of bullets finding flesh. Nakoa took a round through his left shoulder, felt the burning impact and ignored it, kept firing until his rifle clicked empty, then switched to his revolver. Cade went down, clutching his leg, dragged himself behind better cover, and kept shooting from the ground. Then, cutting through the chaos like a blade through silk, came a new sound, hoofbeats, many of them, approaching fast from the north. For a moment, Nakoa thought it was reinforcements for Mercer's men, thought this was truly the end. But then he heard a voice he recognized, Lavinia's voice, shouting orders, and he realized with astonishment that she'd come back. She burst into the firelight on his horse, the 3 rescued women clinging to her and to each other, and in her hand was a burning torch that she hurled with surprising accuracy at the main house. The torch arced through the air like a falling star and crashed through a window, and within seconds, flames began licking up the curtains inside. "Time to go," she screamed at Nakoa, and he needed no further encouragement. He grabbed Cade, hauled the wounded man to his feet, and they ran in a stumbling, desperate sprint toward the horse. Bullets chased them, kicking up dust and splintering wood. But in the growing light from the burning house, the shooters were silhouetted and exposed, and their aim suffered. Nakoa reached the horse, got Cade across the saddle despite his protests, then swung up behind him. Lavinia kicked the horse into motion, and they thundered out of the valley, with fire roaring behind them and death snapping at their heels. They rode hard through the remainder of the night, pushing the horse beyond what was wise or kind, driven by adrenaline and fear and the desperate need to put distance between themselves and what they'd done. As dawn broke over the eastern hills, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, they finally slowed, the horse lathered and heaving, and looked back. In the distance, a column of smoke rose into the morning air, black and thick, marking the funeral pyre of Dalton Mercer's empire. Whether the entire ranch had burned, or just the main house, they'd never know and didn't particularly care. What mattered was that it was over, that the monster was dead, that the women were free. They made camp in a grove of aspen trees, where a spring provided water and the trees provided cover. Cade's leg wound was serious but not fatal. The bullet had passed through muscle without hitting bone. and Nakoa bandaged it with strips torn from his shirt, while the man gritted his teeth and swore creatively. The women tended each other, sharing water and the remaining food, speaking in quiet voices about what came next. Lavinia sat apart from everyone, staring at her hands like she'd never seen them before. Nakoa finished with Cade and moved to sit beside her, not touching, just present. They sat in silence for a long time, watching the sun climb higher, listening to birds sing songs that had no knowledge of human violence. "I killed a man," she said finally, her voice small and wondering. "You did. I thought it would feel different. Triumphant, maybe, or satisfying. But it just feels empty. That's because you're not like them," Nakoa said gently. "Taking a life costs you something even when it's necessary. The fact that you feel that cost means you're still human." She turned to look at him then, her eyes red-rimmed but dry, all tears apparently spent. "What happens now? Where do we go?" Nakoa considered the question, looking at the ragtag group they'd somehow accumulated, 4 traumatized women and a reformed outlaw, none of whom could go back to their old lives. "North," he said finally. "There's a settlement called Silver Creek, about 100 miles from here. It's run by Quakers, good people who ask few questions and offer help to those who need it. We'll take everyone there, make sure they're settled and safe, and after that, he paused, realizing he was about to say something he'd never said before, never allowed himself to consider. "After that, if you want, we could find somewhere to stay. Build something." "Stop running!" Hope flickered in her eyes, fragile as a candle flame in wind. "You mean that?" "I do," he said, and discovered he meant it with a certainty that surprised him. "I'm tired, Lavinia, tired of moving, tired of being alone, tired of living like the world's going to end tomorrow. Maybe it's time to try something different." She reached out then and took his hand, her fingers lacing through his, and they sat there as the sun climbed higher and the world continued its ancient spin. They'd both been broken by their pasts, shaped by violence and loss and betrayal. But somehow, in the crucible of shared trauma and mutual rescue, they'd found something that neither had been looking for. Not romance exactly, that would come later if it came at all, but something equally valuable. A partnership built on trust and understanding, and the recognition that healing was possible if you didn't have to do it alone. The journey to Silver Creek took a week, slow progress with wounded people and a tired horse. They traveled carefully, avoiding main roads, camping in hidden places, always watching for pursuit that never came. Either Mercer's men had given up, or without their leader, they'd simply scattered to find new employment elsewhere. Either way, by the time they reached the settlement, they were starting to believe they might actually survive this. Silver Creek lived up to its reputation. The Quakers welcomed them without judgment, providing food and shelter and medical care without asking uncomfortable questions about how they'd come to be in such condition. The 3 women they'd rescued, whose names they learned were Rosa, Elizabeth, and Sarah, were given places to stay and helped to contact what family they had left. Cade, who'd grown on Nakoa during their journey despite his initial reservations, decided to stay in the settlement, claiming he'd always wanted to try farming, and this seemed as good a time as any to start. As for Nakoa and Lavinia, they rested for a month, letting their wounds heal and their souls catch up with their bodies. They talked for hours every day, sharing stories and dreams and fears, building the foundation of something that felt increasingly like a future. The Quakers offered them land if they wanted it, a small parcel near a creek where they could build a cabin. Plant crops, maybe raise horses. On a cool morning in late November, Nakoa stood on that land and imagined what it could become. He imagined a cabin with a porch, a garden where Lavinia could grow vegetables, a barn for animals, maybe children's laughter someday if they were lucky. He imagined staying in one place long enough to watch the seasons change, to know his neighbors' names, to build something that would outlast him. Lavinia came to stand beside him, following his gaze across the empty field. "Think we can do it?" she asked. "After everything, think we can just be normal people?" "I don't know," he admitted. "But I think we can try, and maybe trying is enough." She leaned against him, and he put his arm around her shoulders, and they stood there looking at the blank canvas of their future. They'd never forget what they'd been through. The scars they carried, both visible and invisible, would always be part of them. But scars were evidence of survival, proof that you'd faced something terrible and lived to tell about it. In the end, that's what stories like theirs were about. Not the violence or the revenge or the dramatic confrontations, but the quiet courage it took to keep living afterward, to choose hope over despair, connection over isolation, building over burning. They'd both been given every reason to let the world make them cruel, to let their pain transform them into something hard and closed. But they'd chosen differently, chosen each other, chosen the possibility that healing was real and futures were possible. As winter approached Silver Creek and the first snow began to fall, Nakoa Flint and Lavinia Pierce broke ground on their cabin, laying the foundation for a life they'd build together. One day at a time, one choice at a time, one moment of grace at a time. And if anyone had asked them whether they believed in redemption or second chances, or the possibility of finding peace after trauma, they would have simply pointed to that cabin rising from the earth and said, "Look, here is the answer, here in wood and stone, and the simple act of refusing to give up." That cabin still stands today, or so the story goes. A testament to what two broken people can build when they decide that survival isn't enough, that they deserve not just to live, but to live well, that the best revenge against those who tried to destroy you is to build something beautiful from the ashes they left behind. Years have a way of smoothing rough edges, of turning sharp memories into something softer, more bearable, like river stones worn smooth by constant water. 5 years passed after that night at Mercer's ranch, 5 years of seasons turning and crops growing, and the slow, patient work of building a life worth living. The cabin Nakoa and Lavinia built became more than just shelter. It became a home, a place where laughter replaced screams and hope replaced fear. They never married in the formal sense, never stood before a preacher or signed papers that made their union legal in the eyes of the law. But they built something more binding than any ceremony could create, a partnership forged in fire and tempered by time, based not on romance or passion, but on the deeper foundation of mutual respect and shared survival. They learned each other's rhythms, the way Nakoa still woke before dawn to check the perimeter out of habit he couldn't break, the way Lavinia sometimes stared at nothing for minutes at a time, lost in memories she never spoke about, but never quite escaped. The land they worked was hard, but honest, giving back in proportion to what they put in, no more and no less. They raised horses, good sturdy animals that carried people across difficult country without complaint. And Nakoa discovered he had a gift for training them, a patience and understanding that translated across species. Lavinia kept a garden that became famous throughout Silver Creek. Vegetables so abundant, she gave away more than they could ever use. And in the evenings, she sewed dresses for the women in town, beautiful things that transformed simple fabric into art. Rosa, the youngest of the women they'd rescued, stayed in Silver Creek and married a carpenter's apprentice, a quiet boy with gentle hands who treated her like she was made of something precious. She had 2 children by the 3rd year, and Lavinia stood as godmother to both, holding those babies with a tenderness that spoke of her own deferred dreams. Elizabeth went east, back to family in Ohio, who welcomed her home despite not understanding where she'd been or what she'd survived. They received one letter from her, brief and formal, thanking them for her life and asking them not to write back. And they respected that boundary. Sarah, the girl who'd stopped speaking, never fully recovered. She lived with the Quakers in a small cottage they built specifically for her, tending chickens and existing in a world of her own making that seemed gentler than the one the rest of them inhabited. Lavinia visited her weekly, sitting in silence beside her, both women finding comfort in shared trauma that required no words. Cade Garrett, true to his word, became a farmer, and against all odds, he was good at it. He married a widow with 3 children and became a father to kids who didn't know or care about the man he'd been before. When he and Nakoa met in town, as they occasionally did, they'd nod to each other. The acknowledgement between men who'd seen each other at their worst and chose to remember each other at their best. News of Dalton Mercer's death spread through the territory like wildfire, spawning a dozen different stories about who'd killed him and why. Some said it was rival ranchers fighting over land, others claimed it was Apache raiders seeking revenge, and a few whispered about a woman with eyes like ice who'd walked into his bedroom and shot him dead. But without witnesses willing to talk, and without evidence beyond ashes and bones, the law eventually stopped investigating, marked it as unsolved, and moved on to more pressing concerns. No one ever came for Nakoa and Lavinia, no marshals or bounty hunters or associates of Mercer seeking vengeance. Perhaps Cade had been right, that without their leader the organization simply dissolved. Or perhaps those who knew the truth decided some deaths weren't worth avenging, that men like Mercer wrote their own endings through the lives they chose to lead. On a spring morning in their 5th year together, Nakoa woke to find Lavinia standing in the doorway of their cabin, coffee cup in hand, watching the sunrise paint the mountains gold. He came to stand beside her, and they watched in comfortable silence as the world woke up around them. A hawk circled overhead, riding thermals only it could feel. In the distance, their horses grazed in the field, tails swishing at flies. Everything was ordinary, beautifully and perfectly ordinary. Do you ever regret it? Lavinia asked quietly, not looking at him. That night, what we did. Nakoa considered the question carefully, as he always did with important things. I regret that it was necessary, he said finally. I regret that the world contains men like Mercer who make violence the only language they understand. But do I regret stopping him, saving you and those women, giving us all a chance at this? He gestured at the cabin, the land, the life they'd built. No, I don't regret that. She nodded, seeming satisfied with the answer, and leaned her head against his shoulder. I still see his face sometimes, when I close my eyes, when I'm not expecting it. He's there, and for a second I'm back in that cellar. I know, Nakoa said, because he did know he had his own ghosts that visited unbidden. But then you open your eyes and you're here. You're safe. You're free. And every day you live well is another day he loses. They stood together as the sun climbed higher, 2 survivors who'd found each other in darkness and chosen to walk toward light. Their story wasn't a fairy tale. There was no magical healing or complete transformation or happily ever after that erased what came before. But it was real, messy and complicated and true, a testament to the stubborn resilience of the human spirit when given half a chance and someone to share the burden. In the years that followed, their cabin became known throughout the region as a place where women running from bad situations could find help. No questions asked, no judgment offered. They never advertised this, never spoke of it openly, but word spread through the underground networks that exist wherever people need help and others are willing to give it. Women would appear at their door, sometimes in groups, sometimes alone, always desperate. And Nakoa and Lavinia would feed them, shelter them, help them find their way to wherever they needed to go next. This was their legacy. Not the violence of that night at Mercer's ranch, but the quiet, persistent work of making the world slightly less cruel, one person at a time. One act of kindness that rippled outward in ways they'd never fully know. And perhaps that's the real story worth telling, not how they destroyed a monster, but how they refused to let that monster define them, how they chose to build rather than burn, to give rather than take, to love rather than hate. Because in the end, that's what matters. Not the darkness we survive, but the light we create afterward. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.